Um, Michelle, I know just from keeping up with you on social media, you're a great educational follow. If you're not following her, you should. Everything, it's like a course study. Um, but I know that uh, you've you've worked in housing and critical theory, and even your like bio that we got from you said you're interested in making a home in racial capitalism, which is a really interesting way to phrase it. So I guess the question is, how is your work in critical theory informed by pragmatic issues such as housing and vice versa? Or how do you see housing as a tool of abolition?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of different ways we could think about this. So when we think about housing, we can talk about it as physical. And so for me, I would approach it through a Black feminist framework and ask the question, what are the interlocking conditions, right, that have led to so many people not being able to have access to housing? And how does everyday knowledge of people who have housing or who actively struggle with this kind of precarity, how does their knowledge open up ways that we might critique the system, right? So here we would be talking about policy change, making sure people know their rights, advocating for like a homes guaranteed, naming previous racist housing practices such as redlining, gentrification, and predatory inclusion. But I also want to say that part of this work is focusing on the practice of home, is how I kind of think about it. And it has to do with race, gender, sexuality, ability, class. We have a lot of narratives around home and family and who we belong to. And so for me, I seek kind of the deepest sort of radical relationality where we question the frameworks that are often given to us. I think that oftentimes it looks like we're in relationship to a narrow group of people, the people in our households, and then people outside of our household. It's kind of like it's charitable of us to engage with people outside of our household, but our main priority is our family. And so I think part of this logic is also that there are bad people or people who need to be rehabilitated and thus need to be taken out of the social order to guarantee security for the people that we love, right? And so in that way, we kind of seed our ideas of good and bad and so many possibilities of connection over to the state so that the state might maintain the social order through carcerality, criminalization, policing, right? And the state has its own ideas, and it even presents moral narratives about what a good home is, right? What a good conception of a family is, and it makes policies around those things, right? This is Reaganism throughout. And so I think what happens in seeding so much of our relationships and what it means to relate to one another over to the state, it means that a disproportionate amount of violence happens for Black and Indigenous folks. Their homes are surveilled and criminalized in ways that I think many people who don't frequently interact with the state don't see. It's invisible to you if you don't actively see how much surveillance and criminalization and precarity happens in Black homes, right? At any moment, even when you think you have safety, like my sister, it's a pandemic, she's a single mother and she has a son, and she is navigating that reality, and the school is like, hey, your son's missed too many days, and if you don't correct this, we're going to take you to court. Why is that the first mechanism for relationship? Why is it some kind of legal leverage that we need to have to relate to one another, right? Like this is literally just talking about a kid missing too many days of school, which is like 10 out of 180, and they're like, okay, well, we're going to go to court because this is the only way to get this right. Yesterday I attended a webinar on abolition and holistic care for parents from the Movement for Family Power. And they named the racist and ableist history that underpins the foster care system, which they call the family regulation and family destruction system. And how that system continues to envision a vision of home that is, I mean, the amount of policy that is incredibly ableist that will result in children being taken from homes is astounding when you look into it. And so both Indigenous and Black people have the highest rates of contact with CPS or foster care system. And there's a lot of violence in the intervention of taking home and then having to go through parenting classes, right? Which is a vision about what parenting should look like so you can get your kids back. And even if you go through parenting classes and anger management, you still may not get your kids back. And if it takes too long, you could lose custody of your kids permanently, right? So like, I think we have to struggle against this kind of logic in order to build loving and healthy communities. And that entails collective action. It's not just like, you're like, Michelle, you're unmarried and you don't have kids. Why are you so concerned with this? But I think it takes all of us. And if I'm going to say that people who have nuclear families should open up their relationship, then I should also be looking for ways to support and be a part of that, right? I understand abolition as the refusal to relinquish relationships to the state. I get this from Rashawn Crawley. And if we refuse to give up our relationship to what the state deems non-normative and thus criminalizes, then oftentimes our motivation for ceding over to the state is our own inclusion and protection, right? But if we refuse that kind of order because we realize the violence it does for those who don't fit into it, then we start to enact different possibilities of relating to one another, different possibilities of accountability to one another that are not rooted in carcerality or criminalizing poverty. This means reshaping what it looks like to practice home, how to take care of one another, how to refuse to let go of each other. Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that abolition is presence. And so while it names violent systems and calls for the dismantling of this system, it also calls for us to be present to one another in a different way. And I think that home is an integral part of that. I've had people say, Michelle, I commend you for the work that you do, the activist thing, but I don't have time for that. So you're kind of like an exemplar in that you do that, but I really don't. I have too many things on my plate to do that. And I want to say that I actually hear part of this claim insofar as we live under a capitalist system that measures our worth and our productivity. But I also want to ask, why don't you have time to care for community? What structures are in place? What institutions, what frameworks are in place? And how can I partner with you or partner with people in your community to struggle against the systems that prevent us from connecting and relating and caring for one another? Because the more that we do that, the more that it becomes collective, the easier this work becomes, the more that we start to build in the kind of relationality that, as Angela Davis says, makes prisons obsolete, right? So that's me.